I rented the fire lookout because of how exposed it was. The listing made a point of that. No trees brushing the walls. No other structures within miles. A square cabin bolted to a steel frame on top of a bare ridge. Windows on all sides. I needed uninterrupted sight lines for long exposure shots and sunrise panoramas. I wanted clean horizons and empty space. The road up was gravel and rock, cut into dry hills scattered with scrub pine and basalt. Eastern Washington in September felt hollowed out. The air had a dusty smell. Everything sounded far away. Even my engine noise faded fast once I shut it off. The lookout sat higher than I expected. The stairs climbed straight up through open air. Every step rang faintly through the metal frame. I hauled my gear up in stages. Camera bags, tripod, food, water. By the time I reached the top, my arms shook and my chest burned. The wind pressed against the walls, but the cabin itself was solid. Thick windows, bolted shutters folded open, a narrow bed, a table, a propane stove that smelled old but clean. From the deck I could see ridges stacked into the distance. The land dropped away in every direction. No roads visible, no smoke columns, no cabins, just brown hills and dark tree lines folded into the valleys. It felt controlled, measured. I could account for everything. I spent the afternoon shooting until the light went flat. When the sun dipped, the temperature dropped fast. The wind stiffened and kept a steady push against the walls. I cooked, logged my shots, and cleaned my lenses. I did not feel watched. I felt alone in a way that settled into my bones. Night came clean and sharp. No haze. No clouds. Stars everywhere. I shut off the interior light and leaned against the glass. My reflection faded. The dark opened up. That was when I noticed the light. It was low in a valley to the northeast. A single vertical glow. Too white for fire. Too steady. It did not flicker or shift. It stood higher than a person, but narrower than a vehicle beam. It looked fixed in place, like it was mounted to something tall. I waited for movement. None came. I checked with binoculars. The light held the same shape. No halo of smoke. No sparks. No color change. I mapped it in my head. There were no roads down there. No trailheads marked on the map. The listing had said no other structures within visible range. That light did not fit. I moved to the west window. The light stayed visible at the same relative angle. I moved south. Same distance. Same height. It was as if it existed only in relation to me. I told myself it was a tower marker. Aviation warning lights sometimes stayed steady. Maybe a communication mast tucked into a fold of land. The map could be outdated. I took a long exposure. The image showed the same vertical line, sharp and unbroken. I went to bed with the shutters open. The light stayed on until I fell asleep. In the morning it was gone. Daylight erased the valley. I scanned the area with binoculars again. Nothing stood out. No metal glint. No cleared pad. No poles. The terrain looked unbroken. Dry slopes. Scattered trees. I hiked the deck perimeter, checking angles. Whatever I had seen did not leave a trace in daylight. I spent the day shooting again. The wind picked up in the afternoon and carried grit that tapped against the windows. I stayed busy to keep my mind focused on the work. I reviewed images. The light appeared in every frame I had taken the night before. Always the same shape. Always vertical. Always fixed. That night I watched for it. It came on just after full dark. Same position. Same brightness. My chest tightened in a way I did not like. I marked the angle with tape on the glass. I checked my compass. The bearing was consistent. Hours passed. The wind dropped. The world went quiet. The light did not change. Then it blinked. Once. Off. On. No gradual dim. No fade. A clean interruption. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. I waited for a second blink. None came. I forced myself to think through possibilities. A generator cycling. A sensor light triggered by an animal. A maintenance signal. None of those explained the isolation or the lack of any other activity. I slept poorly. I kept waking to check the window. The light stayed on until dawn. The third day felt heavier. The silence pressed in. Even the wind sounded muted. I found myself scanning the ridges instead of focusing on my shots. Every reflective surface caught my eye. Nothing moved. That afternoon I noticed how far sound carried. A dropped utensil rang through the cabin and out into the open. The metal stairs creaked with each step. I could hear my own breathing when I stood still. I told myself that if the light was closer that night, I would leave. Night came slower. The stars rose one by one. I sat by the northeast window with my camera ready. The light appeared earlier than before. It was closer. The angle had changed. The tape mark on the glass no longer lined up. The light now sat higher in the valley, closer to the ridge line. Still no sound. Still no movement. Just nearer. My mouth went dry. I checked every window. The light tracked my position again. Always the same distance relative to me. Always upright. I took photos with longer focal lengths. The shape stayed clean. No texture. No spill. It did not behave like a handheld light. It did not sway. I realized then that it was not moving toward the cabin. I was the fixed point. The light was aligned to the lookout itself. Fire lookouts were designed for visibility. They were landmarks. Reference points. Anyone navigating at night could use one. The thought settled heavy in my chest. I thought about survey crews, illegal logging, private land disputes, someone marking my position to see when the light went out. I shut the interior lights off and closed the shutters. The cabin went dark. The wind rattled the metal frame. I lay on the bed and listened. No footsteps, no engine noise, no voices, just the wind and my pulse. I did not sleep. Before dawn I packed everything in silence. I opened the shutters once more. The light was still there, closer than before, now near the base of the ridge below me. I did not take another photo. I climbed down the stairs with my gear pressed tight to my body. The metal rang loud in the quiet. I felt exposed on every step. I did not look toward the valley. I reached the truck and loaded fast. The engine turned over loud and final. As I drove away, the lookout shrank in the mirror. I did not turn around to check the light. Later, back home, I researched the area. Old maps, land use records. I found mention of a temporary survey operation from years earlier. Portable mast lights used for nighttime alignment work. They were mounted on collapsible poles and moved between fixed reference points. Fire lookouts were ideal reference points. The records showed no current permits. No official activity during my stay. That did not bring relief. It confirmed that someone had been working without notice. I deleted the photos of the light. I kept the rest. I never returned to that lookout. I stopped renting isolated structures for work. I still believe the light was human. That makes it easier to understand. It also makes it harder to forget. I drove upstate late on a Friday afternoon in January 2003, expecting nothing more than a quiet weekend and a light snowfall. The cabin belonged to a retired co-worker of my father's, a small one-room place tucked into a stand of pines several miles from the nearest town. I had borrowed it before in summer. In winter it felt farther away, the road narrowing into packed dirt and ice, trees leaning in until the sky became a thin strip above the windshield. The weather radio that morning mentioned flurries, maybe a few inches overnight. Nothing unusual for that area. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sky had already flattened into a dull gray. Snow dusted the branches, but the road was still clear enough. I parked beside the cabin, unloaded groceries and firewood, and took a moment to look around. No other buildings in sight, just woods, a frozen creek somewhere downhill, and the cabin itself with its sagging porch and single front door. The quiet felt clean. That was what I wanted. Inside, the cabin smelled like cold wood and old smoke. I started a fire, stacked my food, and unpacked. There was no cell service even then, which I knew. That was part of the appeal. The radio worked, and there was a landline mounted on the wall, but I never checked for a dial tone. I did not plan to call anyone. Snow began falling before dark. Thick flakes, steady but calm. I cooked, read, and watched the fire burn down to coals. By the time I went to sleep, the windows were opaque with white. The silence outside felt heavy but normal. Sometime during the night, I woke to a sound I did not recognize at first. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced, coming from the front door. Not pounding, not rushed. The kind of knock someone would use if they expected to be let in. I lay still listening. The wind was quiet. The fire had burned low. After a few seconds, nothing else followed. I assumed it had been a branch or snow sliding from the roof. I went back to sleep. In the morning I opened the door and found snow piled halfway up the frame. The porch railing was buried. The steps were gone. I stepped out carefully, sinking almost to my knees. By my rough estimate, more than 2 feet had fallen overnight. The road was invisible. just a smooth white slope where the trees closed in. No tracks, no signs of anything moving through it. The radio said the storm had stalled over the region and would continue through the day. Plows were delayed. Rural roads would be cleared last. That did not concern me at first. I had food, water, heat. I spent the day shoveling a narrow path from the door, keeping the stove fed, and reading. Snow kept falling. The world stayed the same dull white. That night, at almost the same time, the knocking came again. 3 taps. Same spacing. Same gentle pressure. I checked my watch after it stopped. It was just before 11:40. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened for movement. There was nothing. No crunch of snow. No footsteps fading away. Just the faint pop of cooling wood in the stove. I did not open the door. The road was buried. No one should have been out there. I told myself the sound had carried oddly through the cold. Maybe ice shifting. Maybe snow sliding from the roof again. Still, I moved the chair closer to the door and wedged it under the handle before lying back down. The second morning the snow had reached nearly 3 feet. I could no longer see the top of the porch railing. Digging felt pointless, but I kept a small area clear so the door would open. The radio said the same thing as before. Storm continuing. Crews overwhelmed. Remote areas would take time. By then, the quiet felt different. Not peaceful. Closed in. The woods looked closer, darker. Sound seemed to stop at the tree line. Even the creek made no noise under the ice. That night the knocking returned. Same pattern. Same time. 3 taps, patient and controlled. I did not move this time. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths until my heart slowed. When the sound stopped, it left behind a pressure in the air that took a long time to fade. On the 3rd day, I realized how alone the cabin really was. No planes overhead. No distant engines. No sign of anyone else. I tried the landline. There was no tone. Either the line was down or it had never been active in winter. I conserved wood. I ate less. I slept with my boots near the bed. That night, again, at around 11:40, the knocking came. I noticed details I had missed before. The taps were not on the wood of the door itself, but slightly off to one side, where the frame met the wall. They were placed at a height consistent with a person standing on the porch, not someone reaching up from below the snow. When it stopped, I listened longer than before. I thought I heard something then, not footsteps, but a shift of weight, like snow compressing slowly. I did not respond. I did not speak. I did not move. By the 4th night, I was awake before it happened. I sat in the dark, fire low, watching the clock tick forward. When the second hand passed the mark, the sound came right on time. 3 taps. Identical. Not hurried. Not hesitant. As if whoever or whatever was out there had a routine. I stayed where I was. My mind went through explanations I did not like. A lost hiker made little sense. Someone stranded would knock harder, would shout, would try to force the door. An animal could scratch or bump but not knock like that. The regularity bothered me most. The timing. The restraint. The snow stopped sometime during the 5th day. The world outside remained buried, but the sky cleared to a pale blue. That night was the quietest yet. The knock still came. 3 taps. Same place. Same pressure. Same ending silence. By then I was exhausted, nerves worn thin by lack of sleep and constant tension. Still, I did not answer. I did not open the door. I kept thinking about how deep the snow was, about how someone would have to stand close, very close, to reach the frame at that height. I thought about how I never heard anyone approach or leave. On the 6th morning, I heard an engine. The sound came slowly, straining, then stopped. I looked out the window and saw a plow angled into the road, snow piled high around it. The driver dug his way toward the cabin on foot. He cleared the door enough for it to open and looked at the path I had kept shoveled. Later, after the road was passable, I learned what he had noticed. He had seen a second set of tracks each morning leading up to the porch and stopping at the door. They had been partially filled in by drifting snow but clear enough to follow. The size suggested boots. The pattern suggested someone standing there for a short time, then turning back toward the woods. They were not mine. I had not left the cabin at night. The tracks always stopped at the tree line. There were no signs of a shelter, no camp, no vehicle. State police checked the area after I left. They found nothing. The most likely explanation was a local man living rough in the woods, someone avoiding contact, checking cabins for occupancy during storms. Someone who did not want to be seen and did not want to force entry. Someone patient enough to knock politely and leave when there was no answer. I do not know who it was. I only know that someone was there each night, standing on the buried porch in the dark, close enough to touch the door, waiting to see if I would open it. I never did. I never went back in winter. We were 3 days into a backpacking trip that had already gone wrong in small ways that felt harmless at the time. Summer of 2014, deep into a stretch of Oregon forest marked on the map as empty. We missed a turn early on and decided to keep moving instead of backtracking. The terrain was forgiving enough. Tall firs, wide slopes, long shadows, no clear trail but nothing that felt dangerous. We cut cross-country, trusting our sense of direction more than we should have. By late afternoon our legs felt hollow. Packs rubbed raw spots into our shoulders. We were low on water and moving slower than planned. That was when the trees opened up without warning. One moment it was tight forest and filtered light. The next moment we stepped into a clearing that looked deliberate. Grass pressed flat in places. A ring of stones blackened by old ash. And in the center a cabin. It did not look abandoned. It did not look old. The wood was weathered but intact. The roof held straight lines. The windows were intact and cloudy with dust. No road led to it. No path cut through the trees. No sign of recent construction or vehicle tracks. It sat there like it belonged, like it had always been there, like the forest had grown around it on purpose. We stood still for a long time. I remember the quiet more than anything else. No birds. No insects. The kind of stillness that feels deliberate rather than peaceful. We circled the clearing slowly. The grass near the cabin was worn down into dirt in uneven patches. The fire ring looked used within the last week. The smell hit us before we reached the door. Warm wood. Old smoke. Something oily and human. The door was unlocked. Inside felt wrong in a way that was hard to name. The air was warmer than outside. Not stuffy, just warm, like heat that had not fully left yet. A small table sat against one wall with a metal cup on it. A cot stood in the corner with a folded blanket that held its shape. Shelves held a few canned goods, all dusty but organized. A hat hung from a nail by the door. No power, no generator, no solar panels, no sign of modern camping gear. Everything felt maintained, but sparse. We should have left. We told ourselves stories instead. Someone still used it, but was gone for the day. A hunter, a forest worker. Maybe it belonged to the land service and was rarely checked. We told ourselves we were lucky. We told ourselves it was safer than setting up tents off trail with no water nearby. We were tired and we wanted walls. We stayed. We did not touch anything except the floor. We dropped our packs and ate quietly. The sun sank fast behind the trees. The clearing filled with long shadows that leaned toward the cabin. The quiet came back heavier than before. No wind, no movement, just the sound of our own breathing and the creak of wood as the temperature shifted. Night arrived fully without warning. We lay on the floor with our sleeping bags. None of us slept. The warmth inside the cabin faded. The smell lingered. Smoke. Old sweat. Something animal underneath that I did not want to name. The first sound came from the edge of the clearing. It was not a snap or a rustle. It was weight. A slow compression of ground and grass. The sound of something large moving without urgency. It circled wide. Never close enough to touch the light leaking from the windows. Always just beyond it. Every few minutes it stopped. The silence during those pauses felt thicker than the movement. I counted steps without meaning to. Heavy placement. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats again. The pattern never changed. It did not test the door. It did not approach the walls. It stayed at the tree line and moved around us in wide arcs, as if measuring the space. The cabin creaked softly as the night cooled. Every sound inside felt loud. Outside, the pacing continued for hours. No huffing breath. No vocalization. Just movement and patience. It did not behave like an animal looking for food. It did not behave like something afraid. It behaved like something that knew exactly where we were and had already decided what to do next. At some point exhaustion dragged me under. I slept in shallow bursts and woke every time the sound stopped. Each pause felt intentional, as if it was listening for us to make a mistake. Morning light filtered in pale and cold. The sounds were gone. For a moment I convinced myself it had been imagination layered over fear. Then I opened the door. The clearing looked torn open. The grass had been ripped up in long strips. Dirt lay exposed in deep gouges. Several trees along the edge had bark shredded from trunk to shoulder height. One small fir leaned at an angle, roots pulled halfway free. Claw marks cut into the ground in looping patterns that followed the same wide circle we had heard all night. This was not random damage. It was not feeding. It was marking. The realization settled slowly and heavily. We were not the target. The cabin was. The cabin sat in the middle of something claimed. We packed without speaking. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting movement. Nothing stirred. No birds. No insects. The forest felt emptied out. When we stepped away from the cabin, the air felt cooler immediately, like crossing a boundary. We moved fast and straight, no longer guessing direction. After an hour, we found a shallow creek and followed it downhill. By late afternoon, we reached a logging road that had not seen use in years. We followed it until our legs shook. Near dusk, we reached a ranger station used for seasonal work. A single truck was parked outside. The ranger listened without interrupting. His face changed only once, when we described the bark damage and the pacing. He told us the cabin was not on any map. It was not maintained. It was known. A large male black bear had claimed that clearing years ago, habituated but territorial. It tolerated the structure because it had been there before him. It tolerated people when they passed through and left. What it did not tolerate was occupancy. The warmth we smelled came from someone who had used the cabin earlier that day and left before dusk, likely after seeing fresh sign and choosing to move on. The unlocked door was not kindness. It was indifference. Anyone who knew the area knew better than to sleep there. The bear was not hunting us. It was warning the cabin. It was reminding the forest who controlled that space. We had been background noise inside a boundary dispute. The ranger drove us to our car the next morning. He told us the bear was eventually relocated after a hiker refused to leave the cabin and fired a warning shot. The bear returned within weeks. The cabin was dismantled the following year. I still think about how calm it sounded outside that night. How measured. How patient. The fear came later, when everything made sense. My uncle's hunting cabin sat alone in the foothills, tucked into a fold of hardwood forest where the ground stayed damp even after weeks without rain. October 2009 was already cold there. The leaves had turned and dropped fast, piling against the porch steps and the base of the chimney. No road noise reached that far in. The only sounds were wind in the trees and the slow creak of the cabin settling. No one else wanted the place. He had killed himself there, and everyone in the family treated the cabin like a sealed container, something that could spill if handled wrong. I volunteered to clean it out because I told myself it was just a building. I told myself I did not believe in ghosts, memories, or anything that lingered. I still do not. I believed in habits. I believed in neglect. I believed in old wood and mechanical failure. The cabin had one main room, a narrow kitchen wall, a small bathroom, and a back room barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. The back room had been his. That was where it happened. I did not stand in the doorway long the first time. I kept moving, focused on work. Boxes, trash bags, sorting piles. If I stayed busy, the place felt neutral. The smell hit me hardest. Old smoke soaked into pine boards, oil, damp fabric, metal. He had smoked for decades. He quit near the end, or so everyone said. The ashtray on the table was clean when I arrived. I noticed that because it stood out. Everything else was coated in a thin film of dust except that glass dish. I brought my own food, water, and sleeping bag. The power still worked. The radio sat on a shelf near the window. It was old but plugged in. I did not turn it on. I preferred the quiet. At night the woods pressed close, dark and heavy, the kind of dark that does not feel empty. The first night passed without incident. I slept on the couch because I did not want the back room. The couch sagged in the middle and smelled like old fabric and smoke. I woke before sunrise without an alarm. I felt rested but alert, like I had slept lighter than usual. The second morning, while I was sorting through a cabinet of tools, the radio clicked on. The sound startled me because it was loud in the quiet room. It was tuned to a country station. The song was one I recognized from childhood, something my uncle used to play when he drove. I told myself the radio had a loose switch. Old electronics did that. I turned it off and unplugged it. Later that afternoon, I found cigarette butts near the fire pit outside. 3 of them, pressed into the dirt, pale filters darkened by moisture. They looked fresh. The paper was not crushed by rain. I stood there longer than I meant to. I did not smoke. No one else had been there. I told myself animals dragged them out. I told myself someone had trespassed. Neither explanation felt solid, but I accepted them because I had nothing better. That night, the back room door was closed when I returned from the bathroom. I was sure I had left it open. I stood there, hand on the knob, trying to replay my steps. I opened it, checked the room, then closed it again, more firmly this time. I slept on the couch again. The radio turned on a second time the next morning. Same station, same song. I knew that detail mattered, but I refused to assign it meaning. Stations repeated songs. I unplugged the radio again and moved it to a drawer. By the third day, the work slowed. I had cleared most of the trash and boxed the things worth keeping. What remained were his routines made physical. The chair angled toward the window. The table scarred in the same place where his knife rested. The hooks by the door arranged for his coat, his hat, his keys. I noticed I was sitting in his chair without thinking. It was the best place for light. I noticed I ate at the same time each day, late afternoon, not because I was hungry, but because it felt right. I noticed I locked the door the way he did, turning the knob, pulling once, then setting the bolt. That night, I slept in the back room. I told myself it was practical. The couch hurt my back. The bed was narrow and stiff. The mattress smelled faintly of old fabric and cleaner. I lay on my side facing the wall, listening to the house settle. Nothing happened. That was the problem. The place did not resist me. It accommodated me. The next morning I woke at the same time he used to. I knew that because I remembered him calling the house early, always at the same hour. I made coffee the way he did, measured without measuring, poured without spilling. My hands moved without hesitation. I found more cigarette butts near the fire pit. More than before. They were arranged in a neat cluster. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. It felt like recognition. I started paying attention to myself instead of the cabin. I tracked when I slept, when I ate, where I stood. The overlap grew. The routines aligned. Not because something forced them, but because they fit the space. The cabin had been shaped around one person for years. I was adapting to it the way water adapts to a channel. On the fourth night, I realized I had stopped thinking about leaving. The job was almost done. I could have packed up and driven out before dark. Instead, I stayed. I cleaned things that did not need cleaning. I arranged objects that were already in place. I locked the door. I checked the windows. I sat in the chair. I did not turn on the radio, but I could hear the song anyway, not as sound but as memory. I slept in the back room again. I slept on my back, arms at my sides, the way he used to. I woke before dawn, heart steady, mind clear, with the sense that the day had already been decided. That morning, I understood what had scared everyone else away. It was not the manner of his death. It was the completeness of his life there. The cabin did not remember him. It preserved his patterns. Anyone who stayed long enough would fall into them. I finished the last box by noon. I carried it to my truck and set it in the bed. I stood there with the keys in my hand longer than necessary. The woods were quiet. The cabin looked ordinary. Harmless. Inside, I walked through each room one last time. I moved the chair. I opened the back room door and left it open. I unplugged everything. I took the radio with me. Before I left, I wrote down what I had noticed. The sleep times. The habits. The way the space guided behavior. I did it because I needed proof that awareness broke the cycle. When I locked the door for the last time, I did it wrong on purpose. I turned the knob and did not pull. I set the bolt halfway, then fixed it, slowly, deliberately, in a different order. I drove away before sunset. I did not look back. Later, when my family asked how it went, I told them the truth. The cabin was fine. The work was done. There was nothing wrong with the place. I did not offer to keep it. I did not suggest selling it. Some places do not need to be haunted to be dangerous. They only need to be consistent. I drove up the narrow dirt road that led to my uncle's hunting cabin in the Appalachian foothills in October of 2009. The trees were starting to thin out for winter, and the cold had a sharp edge that made me pull my coat tighter around my shoulders. I didn't want anyone else touching the place after what had happened. My uncle had killed himself there a few months before, and everyone else in the family had made excuses for why they couldn't go near it. I told myself I wanted to clean it out, to make it usable, or at least empty it of the smell and the things that reminded him of himself, but deep down I think I wanted to be the one to see it. The cabin was small, a single story with weathered logs and a roof sagging in places. I parked on the overgrown path and climbed out of the truck. The air smelled of wet leaves and would smoke from a neighbor's fire far down the hill. The first thing I noticed inside was how everything felt like it had stopped moving the moment he died. The furniture was in place, the dishes still stacked where he'd left them, the bed made, though not neatly. Dust lay thick on the surfaces, but not everywhere. Some areas looked like they had been used yesterday. It was unsettling, like the house remembered him better than I did. I started with the kitchen, emptying cupboards and drawers, throwing out spoiled food, wiping counters. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you feel it in your chest. When I moved to the living area, the radio was sitting on the shelf, unplugged. I had no idea if he left it there or if the cord had been tucked behind something, but the second I brushed against it, it clicked on. A country song played, the kind of song he used to hum while cleaning rifles or carving wood. I froze, unplugged it, but then it clicked on again 15 minutes later. Same station, same song. I left it alone after that, figuring the old wiring in the cabin was faulty. Cigarette butts started showing up in the ashtray on the table in the small back room, the room he used for his hunting maps and rifles. No one in the family smoked anymore. I didn't either. I cleaned them up, and the next day there were new ones, fresh and unburned all the way down to the filter. I tried to tell myself it was rodents carrying things in, or maybe a trick of the wind, but it made my stomach knot. The door to the back room had a tendency to be closed when I knew I'd left it open. I would leave it ajar, step outside for a moment, and return to find it shut, the knob turned, the latch fastened. I tested it dozens of times, leaving it open and watching. I was careful about wind and drafts, about the slope of the cabin, about every little thing, but it didn't matter. The door closed. I didn't sleep well those first 2 nights. I kept imagining him standing there, leaning against the wall behind the door, but I refused to believe that. I kept telling myself it was just a creaky cabin, would settling after decades of weather. By the 3rd night, I noticed something that unsettled me more than anything else. I was following his routines without realizing it. I would sit in the same chair in the back room, the one he favored, staring at the wall where he pinned maps of hunting trails and logging areas. I found myself waking up at the same hour he did, and I would check the locks and windows the same way he had. I smoked a cigarette even though I hadn't touched one in years, the same brand he used. I noticed I was drinking coffee from the same mug he used, putting it down in the same spot on the table. I felt like I was shrinking into his life, as though the cabin was a vessel designed to fold me into him. I tried to break it. I changed my schedule. I avoided the back room for hours at a time. I slept in the living room and tried to eat meals at irregular hours, but it didn't stick. I would wake up in the early morning, find myself standing by the back room door, unlocking it, brushing off a chair, sitting down, and staring at the wall. I would get up in the middle of the night to close windows and doors, light the stove for heat, smoke a cigarette without thinking. I felt like I was losing myself in slow increments, and the more I resisted, the more the cabin demanded compliance. I spent hours walking around the property, cleaning out sheds, chopping wood, dragging trash down to the edge of the road, but when I returned, the routines returned with me. The sun would drop below the hills, and I would find myself in the chair again, staring at the maps, following rituals I didn't remember creating. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't ghosts, it wasn't anything that couldn't be explained by habit or environment, but it was terrifying in its quiet inevitability. The cabin was a record of him, and somehow, being there, I was reading and rewriting myself in its pages. On the last day, after 3 nights, I finally packed the cabin completely empty. I bagged trash, stripped the floors of rugs, took all the dishes and cups, and cleaned every surface. I stood in the back room for a long time, running my hands over the worn wood of the table, the walls, the chair. I realized that leaving nothing behind was the only way to reclaim myself. I took one last look at the door, left it wide open, and stepped outside into the cold air. The cabin sat quietly behind me, dark and still, and I felt something settle in my chest, a weight lifting. I didn't look back again. Driving down the dirt road, I kept thinking about how easy it had been to become him without noticing, how ordinary the routines were, how natural it felt to fold into a life I hadn't lived. The cabin hadn't needed ghosts to be terrifying. It had only needed memory and habit. I never returned. The cabin stood empty after that, and I never heard about anyone else touching it. I didn't need to. I understood then that the only thing that had haunted it was the man who had lived there, and the way his absence had claimed space in the world so completely that anyone who entered could vanish into it if they weren't careful. I still remember the smell of the wood, the sound of the wind against the walls, the faint music from the radio, the cigarette butts in the ashtray, the door closing slowly behind me, and the chair in the back room. I don't think about him often anymore, but I do think about the cabin and how easy it was to disappear into someone else's life without realizing it. I never went back, and I don't want to. The memory of him is enough. It isn't haunted. It isn't cursed. It just remembers, and it remembers better than anyone else. I took the job because I was out of money and out of options. November in northern Minnesota was not a place people went unless they had a reason. Mine was survival. The state needed someone to check snowmobile trail markers after the first snow, once a week, sometimes twice if storms hit hard. The pay was low but steady. They gave me a map, a radio, and a key to a maintenance cabin that sat miles inside public land near the Canadian border. The cabin was never meant to be lived in full time. It was a stopover, a place to warm up, store fuel, log trail conditions. No power, no running water, a hand pump outside that froze solid after dusk, a wood stove with a warped door. The radio worked only if I stood near the north wall and held the antenna at a certain angle. Once the snow settled in, the nearest town was over 40 miles away by logging road. After the first real storm, no one came through unless they had tracks to follow. The drive-in felt like leaving the world. Cell service dropped before I crossed the county line. Trees thickened. The sky flattened into a dull gray sheet. When I reached the turnoff, the plowed road ended without warning. From there I followed a narrow packed trail until the cabin appeared between the trees, low and dark, smoke staining the snow around the stovepipe. The place felt off before I unpacked. Not haunted. Not creepy in a movie way. It felt occupied in a careless way. There were food wrappers in the trash bin that I did not recognize. Not brands I bought. The dates were recent. A half-empty jar of instant coffee sat on the counter. I did not drink instant coffee. The state gear checklist did not include food storage. I assumed a previous worker had left it behind and thought nothing more of it. That night I slept light. The stove ticked as it cooled. Wind pushed against the walls in long, steady waves. The cabin settled. Every sound made sense. The next morning I checked the trail markers along the southern loop. Snow came down slow and dry, the kind that erased tracks within minutes. When I returned near dusk, the cabin looked the same. Door locked. Windows iced over from the inside. Inside, one chair sat angled toward the door. I was certain I had left it pushed under the table. I moved it back and told myself the floor sloped. Over the next few weeks the job settled into routine. Wake before light. Melt snow for water. Check the map. Walk or snowshoe sections of trail. Replace markers that had drifted or tilted. Log the conditions in a notebook the state provided. Return by dark. Eat canned food. Feed the stove. Sleep. The cabin changed slowly. A different mug appeared on the shelf. Not new, but not mine. Boot prints showed up around the cabin that did not match my tread. Narrow soles. Shallow impressions, as if the person weighed less than me or moved carefully. I told myself they were old prints resurfacing after a melt. The snow was deep enough that prints should have collapsed within hours. These stayed sharp. The radio picked up bursts of static some nights. I checked the frequency. Nothing changed. I assumed weather interference. I started noticing small shifts. The axe leaned against the opposite wall. The stove damper sat half closed when I knew I had left it open. A can of beans went missing. Another appeared in its place. Same brand, different label style. Newer. I kept my gear tight after that. Counted my food. Marked the handles of my tools with tape. I locked the door every night and wedged a chair beneath the handle. Sleep came in shallow pieces. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear doors. What bothered me was waking to find the chair moved again. Always turned toward the door. Never pushed fully back. One morning I found fresh tracks leading from the tree line to the back wall of the cabin. They stopped there. No prints led away. I circled the area and found a narrow trail cut through the brush, almost invisible unless you looked for it. It led to a shallow depression about 50 yards out, dug into the earth and lined with spruce boughs. A tarp covered the top. The tarp was old but not rotten, weighted with stones. No footprints around it that morning. I did not open it. I stood there long enough for the cold to bite through my gloves. Then I returned to the cabin and locked the door. The radio crackled that night. A burst of sound cut through the static. Not words, just a breath of signal. Then nothing. I logged everything in the notebook, sticking to facts. Unidentified use of cabin. Evidence of another person in the area. Possible squatter. I tried to send the message. The radio failed. The weather closed in. Snow piled higher. The trail markers held. No reason to go out as far. The sense of routine grew heavier. The same signs repeated. Someone used the cabin when I slept. They cleaned up after themselves. They did not take much. They did not make noise. I tested it once. I stayed awake all night with the stove low and the lights off. Near dawn, the back wall creaked. Snow slid from the roof. Nothing else happened. When daylight came, the chair was still turned. I found the trapdoor on my fourth week. It was beneath the table, hidden by a loose board. It led to a shallow crawl space dug beneath the cabin. The soil was packed. Blankets lay folded. A small battery lantern. A notebook filled with dates and weather notes written in careful block letters. Trail conditions. Marker locations. My routes mirrored in reverse. The person had been here longer than me. They were not hiding from the job. They were doing it. I read the last page. A name I did not recognize. A note about rotating shifts once winter hit. About avoiding overlap. About waiting until the cabin was clear. It explained the schedule. The absence. The careful movements. They slept during the day while I worked. They worked while I slept. We had shared the same space without meeting. I left the cabin that morning. I packed light and followed the trail out before the snow could turn. I did not return. Weeks later, I received a letter from the state. The position had been filled twice that winter due to a clerical error. 2 contracts issued. Same cabin. Same radio frequency. The other worker had quit quietly and never filed a report. I did not respond. I did not ask for the rest of my pay. The cabin was removed from the roster the following season. The trail markers were reassigned to a different route. I never went back north that far again. I still think about the care taken to avoid me. The discipline of routine. The patience required to share a space without being seen. That was the part that stayed with me. Not fear. Recognition. Someone had decided I did not need to know they were there. My uncle's hunting cabin sat alone in the foothills, tucked into a fold of hardwood forest where the ground stayed damp even after weeks without rain. October 2009 was already cold there. The leaves had turned and dropped fast, piling against the porch steps and the base of the chimney. No road noise reached that far in. The only sounds were wind in the trees and the slow creak of the cabin settling. No one else wanted the place. He had killed himself there, and everyone in the family treated the cabin like a sealed container, something that could spill if handled wrong. I volunteered to clean it out because I told myself it was just a building. I told myself I did not believe in ghosts, memories, or anything that lingered. I still do not. I believed in habits. I believed in neglect. I believed in old wood and mechanical failure. The cabin had one main room, a narrow kitchen wall, a small bathroom, and a back room barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. The back room had been his. That was where it happened. I did not stand in the doorway long the first time. I kept moving, focused on work. Boxes, trash bags, sorting piles. If I stayed busy, the place felt neutral. The smell hit me hardest. Old smoke soaked into pine boards, oil, damp fabric, metal. He had smoked for decades. He quit near the end, or so everyone said. The ashtray on the table was clean when I arrived. I noticed that because it stood out. Everything else was coated in a thin film of dust except that glass dish. I brought my own food, water, and sleeping bag. The power still worked. The radio sat on a shelf near the window. It was old but plugged in. I did not turn it on. I preferred the quiet. At night the woods pressed close, dark and heavy, the kind of dark that does not feel empty. The first night passed without incident. I slept on the couch because I did not want the back room. The couch sagged in the middle and smelled like old fabric and smoke. I woke before sunrise without an alarm. I felt rested but alert, like I had slept lighter than usual. The second morning, while I was sorting through a cabinet of tools, the radio clicked on. The sound startled me because it was loud in the quiet room. It was tuned to a country station. The song was one I recognized from childhood, something my uncle used to play when he drove. I told myself the radio had a loose switch. Old electronics did that. I turned it off and unplugged it. Later that afternoon, I found cigarette butts near the fire pit outside. 3 of them, pressed into the dirt, pale filters darkened by moisture. They looked fresh. The paper was not crushed by rain. I stood there longer than I meant to. I did not smoke. No one else had been there. I told myself animals dragged them out. I told myself someone had trespassed. Neither explanation felt solid, but I accepted them because I had nothing better. That night, the back room door was closed when I returned from the bathroom. I was sure I had left it open. I stood there, hand on the knob, trying to replay my steps. I opened it, checked the room, then closed it again, more firmly this time. I slept on the couch again. The radio turned on a second time the next morning. Same station. Same song. I knew that detail mattered, but I refused to assign it meaning. Stations repeated songs. I unplugged the radio again and moved it to a drawer. By the third day, the work slowed. I had cleared most of the trash and boxed the things worth keeping. What remained were his routines made physical. The chair angled toward the window. The table scarred in the same place where his knife rested. The hooks by the door arranged for his coat, his hat, his keys. I noticed I was sitting in his chair without thinking. It was the best place for light. I noticed I ate at the same time each day, late afternoon, not because I was hungry, but because it felt right. I noticed I locked the door the way he did, turning the knob, pulling once, then setting the bolt. That night, I slept in the back room. I told myself it was practical. The couch hurt my back. The bed was narrow and stiff. The mattress smelled faintly of old fabric and cleaner. I lay on my side facing the wall, listening to the house settle. Nothing happened. That was the problem. The place did not resist me. It accommodated me. The next morning I woke at the same time he used to. I knew that because I remembered him calling the house early, always at the same hour. I made coffee the way he did, measured without measuring, poured without spilling. My hands moved without hesitation. I found more cigarette butts near the fire pit. More than before. They were arranged in a neat cluster. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. It felt like recognition. I started paying attention to myself instead of the cabin. I tracked when I slept, when I ate, where I stood. The overlap grew. The routines aligned. Not because something forced them, but because they fit the space. The cabin had been shaped around one person for years. I was adapting to it the way water adapts to a channel. On the fourth night, I realized I had stopped thinking about leaving. The job was almost done. I could have packed up and driven out before dark. Instead, I stayed. I cleaned things that did not need cleaning. I arranged objects that were already in place. I locked the door. I checked the windows. I sat in the chair. I did not turn on the radio, but I could hear the song anyway, not as sound but as memory. I slept in the back room again. I slept on my back, arms at my sides, the way he used to. I woke before dawn, heart steady, mind clear, with the sense that the day had already been decided. That morning, I understood what had scared everyone else away. It was not the manner of his death. It was the completeness of his life there. The cabin did not remember him. It preserved his patterns. Anyone who stayed long enough would fall into them. I finished the last box by noon. I carried it to my truck and set it in the bed. I stood there with the keys in my hand longer than necessary. The woods were quiet. The cabin looked ordinary, harmless. Inside, I walked through each room one last time. I moved the chair. I opened the back room door and left it open. I unplugged everything. I took the radio with me. Before I left, I wrote down what I had noticed. The sleep times. The habits. The way the space guided behavior. I did it because I needed proof that awareness broke the cycle. When I locked the door for the last time, I did it wrong on purpose. I turned the knob and did not pull. I set the bolt halfway, then fixed it, slowly, deliberately, in a different order. I drove away before sunset. I did not look back. Later, when my family asked how it went, I told them the truth. The cabin was fine. The work was done. There was nothing wrong with the place. I did not offer to keep it. I did not suggest selling it. Some places do not need to be haunted to be dangerous. They only need to be consistent. I drove upstate, thinking I'd escaped the city for a quiet weekend. The cabin was on a small road that branched off the highway, tucked into a stand of pines and spruce. The GPS insisted it was a straight shot, but the last few miles felt like I was following a memory rather than directions. Snow was falling when I arrived, a light dusting that coated the roof and piled on the branches. The cabin itself was small, 2 rooms with a wood stove and a loft, and it smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. I carried in my bags, stacked firewood in the corner, and built a fire. The night was cold, but the cabin held it back. Outside, everything was white and still. The forecast had promised a few inches at most, but overnight, the snow came down fast. By morning, I couldn't see the road from the cabin. It had turned into a wall of white. I shoveled a path, just enough to get to the small shed where the generator was kept, but I could tell there was no way I'd leave until it stopped. I didn't have cell service, not that I expected to. The nearest neighbors were miles away. The quiet was complete. I liked it at first. That first night, after dinner and a fire that burned low and warm, I went to bed around 11. Around 11:40, a soft knock at the door made me sit up. I froze. It was deliberate, polite, almost 3 taps. Not harsh, not hurried. I waited. Nothing else. I told myself it was the wind, a branch against the door, anything. I didn't answer. I lay back down and tried to sleep, listening to the fire crackle. The next day, the snow kept falling. I checked the windows constantly. There were no tracks leading to the cabin other than my own. I thought about the knock, tried to shake it off, and mostly succeeded. The storm made everything seem disconnected from the world. I stayed inside, cooked simple meals, read, and split firewood when the stove cooled. Evening came again, dark and heavy. 11:40 came, and the knocking returned. 3 taps. Polite. Slow. I sat in my chair and stared at the door, the snow outside reflecting the weak light from the fire, imagining someone walking through it. I didn't open it. Each night, the pattern repeated. 11:40. 3 taps. I began noticing little details in the snow when I checked the windows in the morning. I was compulsive about clearing the path to the road, so the snow beyond was untouched, deep and soft. And yet, there were impressions, faint but clear, going up to the cabin door. Boots, I guessed. Not mine. I walked around the cabin, trying to see if someone had come in from the woods, but the snow was smooth beyond the footprints. The idea that someone had managed to walk here and leave again without leaving any trail disturbed me. I started double-checking locks, even though the cabin felt impenetrable. I kept the fire going late, staying awake until the taps faded from my mind. By the 3rd night, I noticed the rhythm in the knocking. It wasn't random. Every night, the same time, the same 3 taps. I began timing my routines around it, finishing chores earlier, staying near the fire when it arrived. I didn't hear footsteps, nothing beyond the knock, but my imagination filled in the rest. I considered leaving, but the snow was waist-deep in some spots. My car was buried, and even if I dug it out, I'd have to drive on an unplowed road through drifting snow. I stayed inside, careful, waiting. When the 4th morning came, the sky was gray but clearing. I shoveled again, clearing a path wider, deeper. The snowplow arrived mid-morning, crunching slowly over the packed drifts. Relief hit me in waves. As the plow driver climbed down, he looked at me oddly. He asked why I hadn't let the other guy in. I froze. He pointed at the tracks in the snow, straight lines to the cabin door, coming every night, then vanishing back into the drift. Not one set of tracks returned from the woods. Not mine. I stared at him, unable to speak. He explained that he had seen it when clearing the road in the mornings, the impressions fresh and perfectly spaced. Some people had reported the same pattern in other cabins over the years, he said, someone walking quietly in deep snow, always polite, never entering. He shrugged as if it was nothing to do about it. I followed the plow down the road, my car dug out behind us. The feeling of being watched faded slowly as I drove away, but the pattern stayed with me. Weeks later, I could picture the footprints, precise and deliberate, the 3 polite taps. There was no fear in them, just presence. The cabin returned to stillness after the snow melted, and the memory of that weekend stayed as sharply as the cold. It was a human rhythm in a wild landscape, an intrusion that made the isolation complete. I never understood who, or what, was at the door. I never wanted to. I only remembered to be careful in the snow, and that the world could be occupied in ways I could not anticipate, even when I thought I was entirely alone. I booked the cabin because it was cheap and far enough away from everything that the map showed nothing but brown and white for miles. Western Colorado in February looked empty in the listing photos. Snow on the ground, pine trees, a sky full of stars. The description promised silence and perfect stargazing. The price was lower than any hotel within an hour's drive. What stood out was that there were no reviews at all. The account was not new, though. The host profile said they had been hosting for years. After I booked, the messages started. Not short check-in notes. Long blocks of text sent at odd hours. They talked about respecting the land, not wandering beyond the cleared area, keeping lights off at night to avoid disrupting wildlife. One message warned me not to leave the cabin after dark for safety reasons. Another reminded me to keep the curtains closed once the sun went down. The tone was not friendly, but it was not aggressive either. It read like someone who had written the same warnings many times. I almost canceled. I told myself I was overthinking it. Remote cabins came with quirks. People who lived out there were careful. The pandemic had been going on for almost a year. I wanted space and quiet. I wanted to see stars without city glow. I packed extra food, filled my gas tank, and drove west. The last stretch of road was unpaved. Snow had been packed down into hard ruts. There were no tire tracks that looked recent. My phone lost service about 20 minutes before I arrived. The directions ended with a single instruction to follow a wooden marker nailed to a tree and turn uphill. The cabin sat alone in a clearing. No other buildings. No visible road beyond the one I came in on. The place looked exactly like the photos. Small, one-story, dark wood siding, metal roof dusted with snow. Smoke stains around the chimney, but no smoke rising. The porch was narrow and swept clean. There were no footprints in the snow except mine. The lockbox worked. Inside, the cabin was spotless. Too clean for a place that saw regular use. The air smelled faintly of cleaner and cold wood. Rules were taped everywhere. On the fridge, on the wall by the door, on the bathroom mirror. Handwritten, all in the same blocky print, black marker on white paper. They were not standard rental rules. No mention of checkout times or trash. They were instructions. Keep lights off after dark. Do not leave food outside. Do not answer the door after sunset. If you hear footsteps on the porch, do not answer. If you hear knocking, do not respond. Remain inside until morning. I told myself it was a joke. Some kind of theme. Maybe the host thought it was funny. The cabin had no decorations, no books, no board games. Just furniture, a wood stove, and a bed pushed against one wall in the single bedroom. The windows had thick curtains already drawn halfway closed. I unpacked while there was still daylight. Outside, the forest was silent. No wind. No birds. The snow absorbed sound. When the sun dropped behind the ridge, the temperature fell fast. I lit the stove and cooked dinner. I turned on a lamp without thinking, then remembered the rules and turned it off again. The cabin looked different in low light. Shadows filled corners. The windows reflected the room back at me. I checked my phone. No signal. I tried the host's messages again, just to ask about the rules. The message showed as sent, but never delivered. By full dark, the sky outside was clear and sharp. Stars packed so tightly together they looked artificial. I wanted to step outside to see them better. I stood by the door with my coat in my hands and reread the paper taped above the handle. Do not go outside after dark. Wildlife reasons. I stayed inside. The first sound came around 10. A soft scrape against the porch boards. Slow. Even. Not heavy enough to shake anything. It sounded like boots, but careful ones. Someone walking with intent, placing weight down gently. The sound moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then it stopped. I did not move. The stove ticked as it cooled. My breath sounded too loud. After a long pause, the sound started again, closer this time, right outside the front door. One step, then another, then nothing. I waited for knocking. It did not come. The footsteps returned 15 minutes later, circling the cabin. The sound changed as it passed over snow, then would again. The pattern was steady. No stumbling. No hesitation. Whoever or whatever it was did not rush. It stopped by the bedroom wall. I could tell because the sound was directly beside my head. The wall was thin. I imagined someone standing inches away, listening. It stayed there. Time stretched. I watched the glow of the stove die down. The cabin cooled. My hands went numb under the blanket. The sound outside did not move. No breathing. No scratching. Just the faint pressure of presence, close enough that I could feel it in my chest. At some point I fell asleep without realizing it. I woke to pale light through the curtains. The sound was gone. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints. No marks on the porch. The air inside felt stale, like it had not moved all night. I packed as soon as it was fully light. I did not make breakfast. I did not clean. I wanted to leave before dark returned. Before I lost courage. I stepped outside and scanned the clearing. Nothing. Trees. Snow. Silence. On the drive back, my phone picked up service again. I checked the app. The host profile was gone. The listing no longer existed. My messages showed as unread. A few days later, I received a refund without explanation. I still think about the rules. Someone had learned them the hard way.